Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 333 of the Psych Files. Michael Britt here. And today we're going to talk about sloppy thinking. And as it turns out, because we've talked about thinking before and some of the heuristics, some of the biases we have in our thought processes, but we're not the only ones. And so I want to talk about a few things that scientists do that is a little bit not such great thinking. And along the lines of, is it time to rewrite the textbooks? We've got some new research out which challenges one of the most established findings in social psychology, and I think you're going to find that really, really interesting. Okay, so you have hopefully heard about the now infamous term, at least I hope so anyway, called Bystander Intervention. And I've had an episode or two, I think, actually, about this concept. Very well known, lots of interesting studies. Started out way back in the 60s with the infamous Kitty Genovese case, which at first was poorly reported. There was a whole story and a movie about how a woman was attacked and killed in New York City, and lots of people, 38 people, saw it happen or heard it happen and did nothing. Newspapers made it into something. They kind of skipped a lot of the details. And we find out that it didn't exactly happen, that some of those people actually did take action. So not total truth there. However, it did lead to some really interesting research, particularly by two researchers, Bibb Latané, which is actually his name, B-I-B-B is his first name, last name Latané, L-A-T-A-N-E, and John Darley, D-A-R-L-E-Y. Really interesting studies. You can see some video from them on YouTube. Basically, the idea is that you get a bunch of people into a room, or you get one person in a room, because what's being manipulated, the independent variable here, is the number of people in the room. So you, let's say you're the one. You're sitting by yourself, filling out some paperwork that the researchers told you needed to be filled out, but which is really just a time filler. And while you're waiting, the researchers have set it up so that there is some sort of an emergency that happens. And I love what they did. Got very creative. You're sitting there, and at the other end of the room, smoke comes out from underneath the door. So that's one emergency. Another one was where a worker, if you will, right, a maintenance guy comes into the room with a ladder, and he goes into an adjacent room, opens the door, goes in as if he has to fix something, and then after a little while, all the people in the room, or you, again, if it's just you sitting there, you hear something happen that sounds like the guy fell. So you hear a bunch of clatter. And I think he says something to indicate that maybe he hurt himself. So if you're alone, of course, you get up to find out what's going on. You go to the door with the smoke under it, or you go looking for the researcher and say, hey, what's going on? I don't know, man. I think that guy might have hurt himself. Or, hey, I don't know, there's smoke coming underneath the door. But if you're alone, and they videotape this, what you see is the people sitting around the table kind of look up. They sort of look at each other. And in some of these studies, the other people in the room are actually not regular people like you. They are working with the instructor. So you come in, you're very, naive and ready to participate in a study, and you sit down. A bunch of other people come in, and they sit down, and they look just like you in terms of, hey, I'm here to do a study. But actually, they've already talked with the researcher, and he's told them that smoke's going to come out from under the door, or the guy, the maintenance guy, is going to pretend he's going to make some noises, but he's really not going to be hurt. And we're going to be behind that door sending smoke in. But don't worry about it. We're interested in what this one true subject actually does. And so the consistent finding here, if you're alone, you'll get up and see what's going on and offer help. If you are with a bunch of people, you'll look to see if they do anything. And if those people don't do anything, then you're likely to just sit there and not do anything either. You'll figure, well, maybe I interpreted this situation wrong. I guess it really isn't. Hard to imagine. I guess smoke coming out from underneath the door is really not that unusual. So what the heck? If they're not going to do anything, then neither am I. Okay, so consistent findings. What it sounds like it makes sense as well. So, what's the new research? Well, an article appears in the American Psychologist, and it's by Richard Philpott from Lancaster University. Did an interesting study, and you might refer to it as looking at well, it's kind of two terms: external validity, and sometimes called ecological validity, which is just simply saying, okay, so you've shown this happens in the lab. We believe it also happens in real life, right? Because have you ever seen a video, maybe it was passed to you through Facebook or something, and you see someone in need of help and nobody helps? I could just see the title to that video now, old lady falls down, no one helps her. But that's because we like to send videos around that are, upsetting, right? Those kinds of videos get clicks. Because a video that says, old lady falls down, people around her come to her assistance. Well, that's not interesting, right? So we see a lot of videos that seem to support this kind of, people are apathetic. Look at them. In my day, people cared about their neighbor, and look what's happening today. And so it gets very popular. So what does happen in real life? Do we see what we saw in the lab, people not helping? Do we see that in the real world? And so Richard Philpott took an interesting approach. He looked at actual surveillance footage. So all those cameras that we have around, and in other countries that they have that much more than we do. So he looked at these footage from these cameras, and he actually also looked not only in the UK, where he's from, but South Africa and the Netherlands, and looked at situations you might refer to as violent, or at least someone is in need of help. And guess what? Here's a quote. He found that in 90% of the cases, at least one person, but typically several, intervened and tried to help. That kind of goes against what we think would happen and what some of the laboratory research is telling us. A little bit more quotes. In 9 of 10 public conflicts, at least one bystander, but typically several, will do something to help. And a final quote here. We find that increased bystander presence is related to a greater likelihood that someone will intervene. So it's interesting. I don't think it means that what we've seen in the lab we ought to throw away, but this is something that everybody's got to look at and say, so what is it? Sometimes people don't help, but you've got a lot of data saying people will help. Are there some other unseen factors at work here? Because that's what happens, right? Out in the real world, all kinds of other stuff is going on, and we don't control it as much as we do in the lab. So we can't depend on the Facebook videos that your friends are sending you, but we also can't depend just on laboratory research either. It really would have been consistent with prior research if in all these surveillance videos we saw what we saw in the lab, but we didn't. So more research has to be done. I think that maybe the textbooks don't have to be rewritten, but they have to be amended with this study and the ones that will no doubt follow it. Something happened in my life this past week, which I'm going to relate to two psychological ideas. My daughter was in a car accident. Now, she's all right. The car was totaled, but it was right at an intersection. There were cars everywhere. It was sent off to the side of the road by another car that was out of place. So, it was an accident. And with all these people around, and it was right around rush hour, the laboratory research might suggest, I don't know, if people are going to help or not because everybody's in a hurry, which goes back to the, we sometimes call the Good Samaritan effect. Interestingly enough, there was surveillance footage. There was a camera outside the gas station, which was also on this intersection. And lots of people did come to her aid. So we've really got to figure this out about this bystander effect. Now, what do people say after you've been in an accident? Thank God it wasn't worse. And so I just kind of sit there quietly and think to myself, couldn't we have said, I wish it didn't happen at all? But we have this very stretchy logic where no matter how bad it is, it could have been worse. And that's somehow supposed to make you feel better. And if it's really bad, where someone died, then we have a tendency to try to find meaning in that it was on purpose. Or the old expression, which every time I hear it irks me, which is what? Everything happens for a reason. I've talked about these things before, and and the thing that I always wind up saying is that life is just chaos. And this is what I've seen. And remember, coming from, I'm a scientist, a researcher, not terribly religious, so that's where I'm coming from. So life is chaotic. And, maybe there's a God, maybe not, I don't know. But I do know that we humans have a really hard time dealing with uncertainty. Oh, and another thing that was said is that my daughter's car had my mother's rosary beads in it. She passed a couple of years ago. And so, of course, thank God the rosary beads were there. Although I don't know how we can be thankful because the accident did. Shouldn't those rosary beads have kept the accident from happening at all? So, anyway, the thing is, when I come away from this and I think, look, what does it matter? I don't really feel like sitting there and annoyingly go through the kind of the fallacies in that way of thinking, because that's boring. So I didn't say anything, and it doesn't really matter. Who knows whether God was involved or not? And it's a harmless belief. And the only time and when things become more important, when people say things to which you ought to stand up and say something, is when decisions are being made based on the interpretation. And so we see that today with the whole anti-vaxxer movement. People are taking an observation that autism begins around the time that children have vaccinations, and then drawing a causal relationship between the two. Of course, we've done all kinds of research. There is no relationship. But it is amazing how people will stick to their beliefs no matter what. In fact, if you attack someone who's against vaccinations, if you attack them too vehemently, we've learned that it's like cornering a cat. I think it's a cat. And then they start really kind of, going at you. So we don't like to be wrong. That really makes us feel bad. It just seems to strike at a real core. And so if you go at someone who has a strong belief in something like anti-vaccinations, they can become even more sure of where they stand. It is amazing. And sometimes people take refuge in an expression that we hear a lot, which is, that everyone's entitled to their beliefs. Yes, I'm not going to argue that. But again, it goes back to, are you going to make a decision based on that belief? And if you're going to decide not to vaccinate a child, then that has significant ramifications. So while everyone can have a belief, not all beliefs have support for them. Not all beliefs are equal. And so this reminded me of a really interesting couple of articles that I have read recently. One of the first experiences I had with a scientist doing research was many years ago. It was a psychological researcher, And his approach to research was to give out lots and lots of personality questionnaires to, of course, college freshmen, give it out to several hundred of them, and then to just correlate everything to see what happens was basically his approach. And so I remember staring at this big correlation chart of all these things. I think there must have been 20 different kinds of personality characteristics that he was just correlating with every other. And then he would look for whatever was below 0.05, right? That's our drawing line, our stick in the sand. Would this happen 5 times or less out of 100 by chance? Which means it will happen. So if you do it 100 times, 5 of those times will be chance. And another way to look at this is we talk about 5 out of 100 times. I'm not going to go too much further with this because it is kind of dull, but it's important. So since 5 goes into 120 times, then all it really means is that you have to do 20 studies. And most likely, one of them will come out significant, at least one, by chance. But researchers take a sort of okay, but it's unlikely, so it's probably not chance. It's probably something real. That's the assumption that we make in what is called, the traditional kind of hypothesis testing. Psychology students have to take good old statistics, and they learn a lot more about it than they really want to. But there's a lot of talk about changing that approach. So along comes a really interesting article called The Statistics of the Improbable, subtitled Bible Codes, Investment Funds, Lotteries, and the Curse of the Look Elsewhere Effect. It's in TowardDataScience.com and written by Samuel Flender, F-L-E-N-D-E-R. He talks about this idea of the look elsewhere effect, which essentially is if you don't find something remarkable in one place, then keep looking and you'll find it. Which, sadly, too much research is a result of this look elsewhere effect. So they begin with an interesting study about the Bible Code. Now, this was done back in 1994 and published in the journal Statistical Science, claiming to find evidence that the book of Genesis predicts the future. So what they did, let me just quote from there. The authors were looking for so-called equidistant letter sequences. If you look at every 5th letter in the book of Genesis, for instance, they were testing if the letter sequences thus generated would contain the names, birth dates, and death dates of a list of 32 notable rabbis, covering the entire span of Jewish history. And if they were able to find such a pattern, this would prove, in their view, that the book of Genesis, in fact, had predictive power. And guess what? They were able to find these names. So, does the Bible have predictive power? Or is this an example of what they call the look elsewhere effect? In other words, you take a huge document and you decide to break it down and just essentially look to see what you find. I mean, if you said, look, I'm going to look through the Bible, and before you even looked at it, and you said, I'm going to look at every 10th letter, and I'm going to extract it, and I'm going to find a specific thing. If you made that prediction beforehand, it might be incredible that if you were to find such a thing, then you would really have me stumped. That would be amazing. But on the other hand, if you do what these researchers did, which is to just kind of keep varying things. Well, if we start here and we look at every 8th letter, or you say, well, if we begin with this paragraph, which is about 8 pages in, or 20 pages in, and we look at every 17th letter, then and then you start to find things, and if some things don't fit, but but that's it's close enough. So it's giving yourself, even what the author here says, his quote, a huge amount of wiggle room. Okay, and it's sort of like the old thing about, well, famous people die in threes. Oh, interesting. Well, if famous people all died on the same day, 3 of them did, then that would be pretty amazing. But of course, it doesn't happen like that. What happens is one famous person dies, and then a week goes by, or 2 weeks go by, and another one dies, and then a month goes by, and the third one dies. And then you say, look at that. See, I told you they all die in threes. So if the amount of time you're willing to give yourself to find this amazing thing is flexible, then by golly, you'll find something that you think is amazing. But if you started off with a prediction of exactly when these famous people will die, it's just like astrology. So I love this quote in this article. Quote, "The more opportunities you give yourself to be surprised, the more likely you will be surprised." And that's the nature of the look elsewhere effect. Other great examples, and that's why I really love this article, and you got to read it. This paragraph, consider a Swedish study from 1992 linking living near power lines to childhood leukemia. Now, I remember hearing about that maybe it's not safe to live near power lines, right? Wasn't there some research on that? Okay, here's what they did. The researchers surveyed, this is continuing the quote, everyone living within 300 meters of high-voltage power lines over a 25-year period. And they looked for statistically significant increases in over 800 different ailments. Okay, so this is just like the researcher who just said, throw out all the, give these couple of hundred students all these personality tests, and then just see what comes up out of it. And of course, what we do is something will, right? Just by chance, there will be an association between some group of people who live within 300 meters of a power line. What is it that electrical power lines could be influencing in human beings? And then once you've got that, whatever that is, whatever illness you have some research to substantiate, it ought to influence this specific illness. Or let's say you pick 3 of them. Pick 3. Don't pick 800 of them, because you will find it there. But the best way that we're finding to do research is this way, right? You publish your hypothesis even before you start looking, before you start doing any of the research. You say, look, I based upon X, Y, and Z, a certain exact distance, not 300. Well, you didn't find it at 300 meters. Let's look at 500 meters, right? This number of meters generates, an exposure to electrical power, which could have influences on these 3 illnesses. And you post that online for people to look at and give you some feedback on, and tell you, whether they think you're going down the right road here. And that's before you collect data. So another interesting, they quote, I don't know if you've ever heard of this. This is, I didn't. It's kind of weird. Have you ever heard of a site called xkcd.com? I don't know how anyone remembers this website. I mean, who remembers XKCD? But it's quite famous, understandably so. The person who I'm looking at the site now, and I'm looking for who it is, because I do want to. He writes cartoons. Very insightful. Oh, I see he's got a book here as well. Randall Munroe, Munroe. And the subtitle here of his book, he's got a book called How To. And in the subtitle is Absurd Scientific Advice for Common Real-World Problems. One of his cartoons, and it's really interesting. One person runs toward another person and says, hey, look, jelly beans cause acne. You always hear those sorts of things, particularly on TV. But what he shows here, if you took every conceivable color of jelly bean and you correlated it with, let's say, acne, okay, at least you've got one thing. And by the way, why would a specific color of jelly bean cause an increase in acne, right? So there's no theory there. But if you look for it and you include enough colors, you'll find it. Okay. I think the point's pretty clear there, the look elsewhere effect. All right, I'm going to stop there, even though I've got a couple other examples. I'll save those for another episode. it is interesting to see how we are pattern seekers, and we find them. we delude ourselves sometimes by just allowing our thinking to be kind of sloppy. Okay, thanks so much. I will see you on the next episode of the Psych Files. Michael Britt here. Take care.